Well, there was the death of the kulaks, I told you about that. There was the Ukrainian famine, that's 6 million gone there. There was the rise of the Gulag state because it turned out that Russia, the Soviet Union, couldn't run on the principles that it had laid down as sacrosanct. They just didn't work, so you had to enslave everybody and run your economy as a slave state, essentially, and try not to kill the people in the gulags so fast that you can't suck some productive labor out of them. There's the death of tens of millions of people. We don't even know. The estimates range from 15 to 60 million. And like, we won't get too picky about the numbers because after the first 10 million, you kind of made your point. And the fact that we don't know between 15 and 60 is actually an indication of the horror of it, because our count is off by tens of millions, and that's only within the last century. And then there was the 1956 crackdown on...
Our count is off by tens of millions. That's because this isn't real scholarship. This isn't rigorous scholarship yet. And, you know, there was less ability to take like census numbers and things like that back then, just because technology wasn't as developed. But the reason there are, you know, gaps in our numbers of tens of millions of people is because this isn't actually rigorous history. A lot of these death tolls are just wildly inflated. You know, a lot of the death tolls counted against the USSR include people who died in World War II fighting the Nazis, right? That's supposed to be considered the death of socialism or death of communism. And why do they always focus on the death tolls, right? Why is it only the death statistic, which are often inflated statistics? Why don't they give material or data-based statistical analysis of the economy, of the industrialization process at the time, of the social programs enacted? Why don't we go in detail here? Why don't we talk about a nuanced comparison of Stalin's method of economic planning enacted after Lenin's death, or, you know, compared to Lenin's new economic policy, the NEP? Why don't we talk about the differences that these affect in the economy and in people's lives? Or why don't we talk about, you know, what post-revolutionary Russia looked like compared to pre-revolutionary Russia? Or why don't we ask the question, would Russia have defeated the Nazis had they not had the revolution? Well, we can't ask that question, nor can we do actual material data-based analysis. Well, we can, Jordan Peterson can, because it would show the truth. It would show the truth that, yes, the USSR made many, many, many mistakes, but they still vastly increased standard of living for their people. And of course, they wouldn't have been able to defeat the Nazis if it wasn't for the revolution, right? They would have been walked over. They would have had this agrarian economy with no industry, with no tanks, with no weapons to defend themselves. Instead, they went through the fastest process of industrialization that had ever been seen in human history and mass-produced these tanks and other things that their military needed to defend itself. And they lost millions of people, but they held on to their sovereignty. They beat the Nazis, and the world owes them a huge debt of gratitude for doing so. But we can't talk about historical developments. We can't talk about the material. We just have to talk about how evil Lenin and Stalin are, and how anybody who thinks that capitalism can be better or that socialism could work is also evil and dumb. Everything is brought to the individual level. It's all individualized and brought to the level of a moral judgment, either good or bad, so that Peterson can make moral judgments against individuals or against isolated events, right? There was this famine. Famines are bad, therefore socialism bad. Therefore, anybody who thinks socialism could work or criticizes capitalism is also bad and also supports famines. Right? There's no, okay, that famine happened, that was bad. Why did it happen? What were the material conditions that allowed it to happen? What were the weather factors? What was going on with the collectivization process at that time? How many tractors and actual machine industry and infrastructure did they have in agriculture working at the time? Right? There's none of that. There's no historical context or what would be actual scholarship that helps us explain the world. They just take isolated events, the famine, so that they can make a moral judgment bad against individuals, those who support socialism or Lenin or Stalin, all bad. And, you know, it's the bourgeois method of history, the liberal method of history, the great man of history fallacy that Peterson uses to condescendingly say all young revolutionaries are just dumb and naive, when we know a hell of a lot more than him.
Hungary and the 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia. Then there was the whole like thermonuclear Holocaust thing that was going on at the same time, and the fact that in 1962 and in 1984 we were seconds away from complete annihilation, right, during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
So I'll get into the Cuban Missile Crisis in a sec, but I forgot to say that the basis of most of his scholarship here, right? So this is the second basis for his scholarship. The first is Solzhenitsyn's, I'm probably pronouncing his name wrong, but his Gulag Archipelago, this experimental fiction, this historical fiction. But the second basis for his scholarship is the Black Book of Communism. And again, this is what I mean when I say it's embarrassing. It's a joke that this is considered like the greatest scholar in America. Like this is considered one of our intellectual leaders. Two of the book's own authors, two of the people who wrote the Black Book of Communism, denounced it and any association with the book because it was so historically inaccurate. And they didn't want their reputation as rigorous historians to be ruined, which, you know, anybody who cites this book as if it's true and who doesn't know this, their reputation for doing historically rigorous scholarship should be ruined. Jordan Peterson. Harvard University Press retracted the Black Book of Communism for historical inaccuracies. Freaking Harvard, which constantly pushes out State Department goons and military industrial complex goons and, you know, right-wing think tank NGO goons, denounced this book for historical inaccuracies because they knew it wasn't historically rigorous. There were tons of criticisms of this book that have been published by non-Marxist historians like Peter Kenez, who was a Soviet film historian that wrote a formal criticism of the book because he thought it was so ridiculous. Two of the book's authors said that one of the authors, Courtois, was obsessed with hitting 100 million deaths. His whole goal in writing the book was to say that communism killed 100 million people, which is hilarious and ironic that Peterson says, you know, there were a lot of deaths under communism, but after the first 100,000 or so, you've kind of made your point. Like, what do you mean? We want to know the truth. We want to know how many people actually did die, especially if it was this large number that you said. What do you mean after 100,000, you've kind of made your point? The point of scholarship isn't to make a point. The point of doing scholarship isn't to make a political point that says communism is evil. So you'll stretch and change what happened in the material reality in order to make your argument, right? Which, I mean, Peterson there kind of shows what the purpose of the Black Book of Communism was, which is what Peter Kenez in his criticism of the book says it was, just a polemic against communism, an anti-communist polemic, a way to isolate as many events as possible that make the USSR look bad, compile them and say that they killed millions and millions of people, or that communism itself did that. The book highly inflates the deaths during the famines in Ukraine, what's called the Holodomor. And obviously, we've already talked about this quite a bit, but the Black Book of Communism blames these deaths on communism, when modern analyses of the famine, even from non-Marxist historians like and agronomists, Robert Conquest is a historian and Mark Tauger is a Soviet agronomist or Soviet agricultural historian, who showed that the Black Book's deaths are highly inflated. And, you know, there's no evidence that the communists, the socialists intentionally starved people, right? You had the kulaks, the wealthy capitalist farmers who were hoarding grain and trying to hoard their wealth against the collectivization efforts of the Soviets. So yes, they had to be dealt with, but it was not Stalin taking a giant ice cream scooper and eating all the grain in Ukraine so that nobody else had any grain to eat, which is basically what the Black Book of Communism says. There's also been a really good historical analysis of the deaths in the Gulag that showed they are less than a third of what was portrayed by the Black Book of Communism, right? And then there was a historical analysis done of this book, of this scholarship, saying that the deaths were inflated by about 700,000 even in this. So they were closer to 100,000. You know, which still isn't ideal, of course, but you can't boil the entire country down to that. You can't boil the entire country down to their prison system and say this is the only thing that happened, especially when you live in the US, which has far more prisoners in jail right now doing prison labor than the Soviet Union ever had in the gulags. So the Black Book of Communism has been debunked by even non-Marxist mainstream historians. Nobody takes this scholarship seriously except for people like Jordan Peterson, which is why I keep hitting on the fact that he is not intellectually rigorous, right? His work is not up to scholarly standards, which in a world that makes sense in a socialist society within an academy and education system based on getting to the truth and understanding reality as best we can, someone like this would be debunked in seconds, right? People would be like, okay, that's not accurate. You know, you have to look at the historical context. Here's this fact, that fact, this fact. But instead, this guy's given thousands of dollars by right-wing NGOs funded by the ruling class to boost these false ideas and these false conclusions to people who might not know, to people who definitely don't know that his scholarship is non-rigorous, that his scholarship is a joke. And there are also a bunch of Chinese historians. Obviously, Peterson focuses on the Soviet Union here, but sinologists and Chinese historians, non-Marxist ones, have debunked the claim that Mao killed 65 million people. We did a video on this called The Construction of Modern China. I actually know a lot more about China than the USSR, and the Black Book of Communism accuses Latin American countries of communism killing tons of people in Latin American countries, which is hilarious when you look at what capitalist imperialism and neoliberalism has done in Latin America with Operation Condor, and the installing of leaders like Augusto Pinochet via coup. The deaths of capitalism in Latin America would be far more than any number you could even make up to blame on communism. Like I said, a bunch of sinologists, Chinese historians who have debunked what the Black Book said about communism. We don't have to go into them right now, but it's a similar thing with the Great Leap Forward, where there were people who died of famine at this point, but prior to the revolution, people were dying of famine all the time. And after the industrialization and collectivization process in the Great Leap Forward, people stopped dying of famine. And today, China's abolished extreme poverty.
The keys were in the intercontinental ballistic missile release systems, and Castro, as he admitted to Jimmy Carter, in case any of you are Castro fans, which you shouldn't be, that he was perfectly willing to have Cuba annihilated if it would have meant the defeat of the United States.
So that's actually not true, and I had to look that up because I had never heard of that before. So shout out to Peterson's propaganda for actually giving me the impulse to do some real research and learn what happened. But Khrushchev said that to make himself look better and make the USSR look better, probably, which screw Khrushchev, not a fan. But anyways, he said that Castro had said, to go ahead and attack the US and that Cuba was willing to be sacrificed. And Castro was so upset by that, he actually had to send Khrushchev a letter where he was like, that is not what I said. Right? I did not say to preemptively attack the US and that Cuba would sacrifice itself. What he said was that the determination and the morale of the Cuban people was so high that they would be willing to fight heroically to defend their sovereignty against the US and Western imperialists, even if those imperialists were prepared to use nuclear weapons, or if they were even if they would preemptively strike one of the socialist countries. And he reiterated at the end of his letter that the end of his original letter, which Khrushchev claimed he was calling for a preemptive attack, he reiterated at the end that the Cuban people would observe the events calmly, and they did not want to attack, but that everyone should be aware that the U.S. might do a preemptive attack the way that they did in Japan, right? And he said that the Cuban people were prepared for that. Right. And the U.S. couldn't just get Cuba to submit, get Cuba to bend the knee by threatening to use nukes. He said that our people's determination and their will to be sovereign is so strong that, we won't back down from the U.S.'s threats, even though they have nuclear weapons. And obviously, Castro wouldn't be calling for a preemptive strike. He knew that would get him killed. That would lead to nuclear warfare in which Cuba would be one of the first targets and which they would have no chance against the United States. And what's so hilarious about this, too, this claim that Castro was willing to sacrifice Cuba to the U.S. and wanted to just attack them with nukes, is if you look at the leaked transcripts from within the State Department, from within the meetings that JFK was having with the CIA and other State Department officials, there were constantly State Department higher-ups and CIA officials trying to get JFK to use nukes, telling him that Cuba wanted to preemptively strike the US and the USSR wanted to do a preemptive strike, so we should attack them first. There were literal people in JFK's ear telling him to do this, telling him to launch the nukes. And he didn't, and then he came for the CIA, and then he ended up getting assassinated, which is a video for a different day. But we're supposed to believe communism could never work because of a sketchy, probably not true story or letter that Castro said he wanted to preemptively attack the US when Castro said absolutely not. That's not what we want to do. You know, we want to act in self-defense and not give up our political and economic sovereignty. That proves communism doesn't work. But in the capitalist countries, where CIA and State Department higher-ups are begging the president to launch nukes in another country, that doesn't prove capitalism doesn't work. By your own logic, JP, these transcripts prove that capitalism could never work, and anybody who supports it is actually a bad person who doesn't understand history, which, you know, that's actually kind of true.
And then in 1984, approximately, I may have the date exactly wrong, the Russians received an indication from their early warning systems that the Americans had launched 5 thermonuclear missiles, and one Russian decided that it was a mistake and refused to launch the retaliation. And he just died about 2 weeks ago. So, you know, that was pretty close. And so that was experiment number 1, let's say. That wasn't good, that experiment. Let's put it that way. It wasn't good. It was exactly the antithesis of good. It was precisely the antithesis of good. But that wasn't all. I mean, there's the People's Republic of China. That's a different country, like seriously a different country.
So he says it was the antithesis of good, you know, which is almost a Marxist word or a dialectical word. You know, everything has its antithesis. Everything has its opposite. But why didn't you mention any of the good things that happened in the USSR then, Jordan? If we're going to make an honest experiment, if we're going to make an honest analysis of this experiment and look at it as an experiment, sure, you can mention the gulags. You can say that was bad. You can look at the Cuban Missile Crisis. You can say that was bad. You know, you can isolate a lot of things and say they were bad. You can say that the collectivization process in Ukraine should have gone different and, you know, should have understood that the kulaks were going to try and hoard grain and resist the economic planning and, you know, do things differently. Hindsight's 2020. But, you know, like I said, that's what China did when they were trying to go through a similar process of industrialization and constructing socialism. They looked at what the Soviet Union had done, said, you know, I think the actual phrase they use is like 70% of what Stalin did was good, 30% bad. And we throw out what was bad and we take what was good. But you can't do that if you only look at the bad, right? All you did, Jordan, was isolate a bunch of historical events, talk about them not within their historical context to say that they were bad, and therefore the whole experiment is bad. It's the antithesis of good. Well, okay, if you're going to make that judgment, then you have to talk about the good stuff. You have to talk about the fact that it was the fastest increase in life expectancy ever seen in human history at the time, and the fastest industrialization, and that the USSR blew Japan out of the water and blew other capitalist countries out of the water when it came to industrialization and doing this. You have to mention that literacy was 17% before the revolution, 100% after the revolution. You have to mention that they, you know, created more tractors and created more agricultural infrastructure than any other country at the time, faster, which ended famines. There had been famines going on for years and years and years and years prior. There were some famines in the early years of the USSR, and then they went away because they industrialized agriculture and they could produce enough for all their people, right? So if you're going to say this was the antithesis of good, you also have to discuss the things that are good so people can make an honest judgment. But you're not doing that because you're not an honest person. You're not an honest historian. You're not an honest scholar. You're somebody who's trying to make a political point. You're somebody who's trying to portray an ideology you don't like as being wrong and evil. So we don't get a dialectical analysis of the good and the bad, which if you want, you know, an actual dialectical analysis, like I said, read the debate within the Communist Party of China at the time and what they were saying about the USSR and the criticisms they were making of it. Peterson just isolates the bad because this is a work of propaganda, not a work of scholarship.
right? Different tradition, different language. How many people died in China under Mao? No one knows. Same issue with the Soviet Union, although Mao was a bigger monster than Stalin, and that's impressive, you know, because there's Hitler, there's Stalin, and there's Mao. And of the three, Mao was probably the worst. He's still revered in China. Maybe that accounts for their affinity for North Korea, which could still destroy us all, the remnant.
Welcome to Watch Mojo Jordan Peterson's top 10 most evil communist leaders. At this point, he's just listing them off. There was Stalin and Mao, and you know, this one was worse than that one. Okay, how, Jordan? How, Jordan? I keep hearing this guy was bad, that guy was bad. They're so evil, you can't even laugh at it. It's not funny. How do you make the moral judgment that Mao was more evil than Stalin? And how do you measure evilness on a scale? Oh, wait, you can't. It's an arbitrary moral judgment that you can place on anyone that allows you to make whatever argument you want, including these absurd, baseless, ahistorical arguments you're making here. And, oh, shoot. Did he mention the Great Leap Forward yet? Here, we'll play till he mentions the Great Leap Forward, then I'll continue.
Of that horrible state. Maybe 100 million people died in China during the Great Leap Forward. That's a hell of a leap forward. Well, maybe it wasn't 100 million, you know, maybe it was only 40 million. But as
it was quite literally a very great leap forward. It was quite literally the fastest increase in human life expectancy ever seen in human history. Right? Previously, it was the USSR, which you said was all evil and never did anything good. And then they were overtaken by China. Right? The first 10 years of the revolution, fastest increase in life expectancy ever. Watch our video on the construction of modern China if you want a more detailed analysis of this. But that wasn't that didn't do anything good, right? There was a famine at the time, right? So if there's a famine at the time, that means all of it was bad and everything China ever did was bad, even though, same with the USSR, there were constant famines in pre-revolutionary China. And then after the Great Leap Forward, after the industrialization and collectivization of agriculture, no more famines, and eventually they abolished poverty. But it's so easy always for people who live in industrialized nations, like Jordan Peterson, somebody who's never lived without the comforts of the Western world, who's never lived in a society without industrialized agriculture, where most of the people are peasants working under feudal landlords like pre-revolutionary China was. It's so easy for him to dismiss the gains of the revolution in China and the construction of socialism in China. Oh, yeah, so what? They industrialized and taught everyone to read. And, you know, now within 10 years, they were able to feed everyone and bring everyone healthcare. Who cares? We have those things in the U.S. That's why the U.S. is better. You know, the U.S. industrialized using imperialism and slavery and terrible exploitation. They still did it much slower than China. And yeah, the early years of the revolution were hard, right? China needed to figure out how to meet millions and millions and millions of people's needs, and they didn't have anything. Not only did they not have infrastructure and steel and industry, but their people didn't even know how to make steel. Their people didn't even know how to work with industry because they had been peasants doing farming for the feudal landlords for years. So that's why they needed these backyard furnaces, which have become, a famous thing in Western propaganda. They claim that Mao had these backyard furnaces because he was so inept. He didn't know how to run an economy, and he had people making steel in their backyard. But that was because China didn't have any industry, so their people didn't know how to do anything except run a peasant economy. So they had to use backyard furnaces to teach their people steel working, so the farmers could learn how to use steel, learn how to make tractors, so they could industrialize agriculture and produce enough to feed everybody, which they did, despite the fact that people did die of famines in the beginning. But like I said, those famines were caused by weather conditions, and they were happening for years prior. Famines were rampant in China before the revolution. But of course, the historical context is never given. We have to isolate historical events. We have to isolate them from their context. Otherwise, they might make sense to people, and people might actually have a realistic understanding of history and how the world works. Right? The famine during the Great Leap Forward in China was the last one. It was the last one before agriculture was industrialized and they could produce enough food for everybody. Right? And like I said, the collectivization process was hard. It was, but it freed their people from starvation and freed their people from imperial domination. The sacrifice of those people in early China to industrialize and collectivize saved the future of their country, which is why the US hates it so much, which is why the US actually looks at the Great Leap Forward as if it was the worst thing that's ever happened in human history. And here's the video on the construction of modern China if you want to watch it.